Well, hello and welcome. I'm glad that you're here with us as we continue our chronological read through of the Bible. Today we're going to resume our narrative of King David's reign. And the two readings that we have are parallel. We'll have a reading from 2 Samuel chapter 7 and a reading from 1 Chronicles chapter 17. Um, Actually, at times they seem to be virtually identical. Uh, God has given King David and Israel a rest from the constant wars of the past years. King David's palace has been completed, and there is, at least for now, peace in the land. So King David recognizes that he's living in this luxurious palace, and the ark of God, the ark where God's presence is, still sits in a tent behind a curtain. So he determines that he wants to build a dwelling place for the ark. He tells Nathan the prophet of his plan, and Nathan, at least at first, agrees that it's good for him to do that because God is with him. But that evening, God speaks to Nathan and he delivers a rather surprising message. God says that he's perfectly happy in the tent where he dwells, the tent that he had commanded Moses to build and where he has resided throughout Israel's journeys. God reminds them that he hasn't asked Nathan and King David. He reminds them that he has not asked for a house of cedar. That he took David from the pasture and he made him ruler over his people. He's been with David every step of the way, just as he has with his people. And he's cut off David's enemies from before him, just as he has his people. And then God tells Nathan to tell David something that's really extraordinary. Four promises of God to King David. First, God tells Nathan to tell David that he is going to make David's name great. Now, recognize there are only three great names in the Old Testament: Yahweh himself, Abraham, and now David. So this is a very significant thing that God has promised to do for David. Second, that God would appoint a place for Israel where they and David would have no fear of enemies. Now, remember the constant wars that Israel has been enduring? That promise must have sounded especially sweet at that particular point in time. The promise also reflects the promise that God made to Abraham about the land of Canaan in the first place, a promise that's really being fulfilled in David's reign. And maybe you've already noticed that there's an eschatological meaning to this promise as well, an end times aspect of the promise. We wait for the final fulfillment of this promise to David in the new creation on the last day, when indeed there will be a place where we have no fear of our enemies, especially sin, death, and the devil. Third, God promises to build a house for David, a dynasty. He's not going to build him a brick and mortar house, but to build him a dynasty. A descendant's going to come from David's own body. God's going to establish that descendant's kingdom, and that descendant will build a house to God's name. God will secure that kingdom forever because the descendant will be God's son, and God will discipline him just as a father would discipline his son. Even though this descendant would sin, God would not withdraw his favor from him as he had withdrawn his favor from Saul. Now, there's a lot of different things going on in there, and you may have noticed some things. It's like, oh, I know who that is, and then all of a sudden, well, now I'm not so sure who that is. Suffice it to say that this promise is fulfilled both in Solomon, David's immediate son and successor to the throne, and in Jesus, David's descendant who reigns over all creation eternally. Solomon rules over a large and a secure Israel. Solomon builds the temple, which God will not allow David to build. Solomon sins against God by worshiping the idols of his many wives. And though God disciplines Solomon, he does not withdraw his favor from him like he did with Saul. Indeed, God keeps one tribe, Judah, in David's line, even after Solomon, in fulfillment of this particular promise. Of course, this promise also points to Jesus. Jesus is descended from the line of David, even as he is God's son. God's favor forever rests on the sinless Son of God, Jesus. Remember, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased, as Jesus is being baptized, and then also on the Mount of Transfiguration. And of course, God's favor rests as well on us who are baptized into Jesus. And finally, the last of the four promises that God makes, he promises that this kingdom is going to last forever. Well, David's enduring kingdom is fulfilled in the eternal reign of the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So Nathan tells David all that God had told him, and David immediately goes into the tabernacle to give thanks and praise to God. David understands now that he has become the heir of the messianic promise first given to Abraham, that God is teaching him about this Messiah. He acknowledges that his words can never be enough to thank God for his mercies and grace or to earn his mercies and grace, and that God is unique and great, that there's no one else like him. Indeed, there really is no other God at all. David asked that God would fulfill his promise and also that God would bless his house. In other words, David repeats back to God God's own words to David, asking God to do what he has promised him that he will do. That's very much a model for our prayers as well. May God be with you and bless you. As always, I pray that you're learning and growing from these readings, and that you will continue to spend that time with us. I look forward to gathering with you again tomorrow.